Just before we get started with today's video, I do want to thank today's sponsor, Total AV, for making it possible. Back in the day, when you got a computer, you got antivirus software. It was just what you did. But today, we don't really worry about it so much. But malware is more sophisticated than ever, and everyone should have good antivirus. Yes, even if you have a Mac, this still applies to you. One of the biggest problems today is spyware, which can harvest your data and collect personal information on you, such as usernames, passwords, and browsing information. Indeed, last year, hackers stole 500 million personal records. That's where Total AV comes in, protecting you. They'll keep you safe against malware, ransomware, spyware, and phishing attacks. Total AV detect and remove viruses, adware, and other things that might remain undetected on your computer. You can get 1 year of Total AV Pro antivirus for just $19.99. That's 80% off. And if you're not happy, 30-day money-back guarantee. And let's get into it. If I ask you to think of a country where more than 80% of the inhabitants live in state-built homes, many will surely think of a socialist republic or maybe a former Soviet bloc country, right? Well, what if I told you that this figure corresponds to one of the countries with the freest and most deregulated economies, possibly the most capitalist country in the world? Surprised? Well, Singapore is an unusual case, an exception in terms of housing models. The Southeast Asian city-state, famous for its towering skyscrapers, impossible architecture, and for being one of the largest financial centers in the world, has developed a public housing system that is globally unique. So some of you might now be thinking, if you're regular subscribers, but Simon, you already told us on this very channel that Vienna also has an extensive public housing system. And, well, yes, you're absolutely right. However, we're talking about two very different models, completely different models, in fact. The great difference between Vienna and Singapore's model lies particularly in the percentage of property owners. While the Viennese model is oriented towards rentals, 3/4 of the population rents city council-owned homes, the Singapore model is just the opposite. More than 90% of Singapore's citizens own their own homes. Of course, 80% own homes promoted, built, and granted by the state. Yes, we're talking ownership-oriented public housing. Ownership with a few catches, if we're being completely honest here. But we'll talk about that later. First, we need to ask ourselves some questions. Why does Singapore apparently reject the free market real estate model? How on earth can they develop a property-oriented public housing system? How has this model affected private real estate developments? And is the Singapore model replicable in other countries? Well, let's get to the bottom of all of these questions, shall we?
Singapore, a small land and a huge population.
Dear friends of VisualPolitik, first we need to familiarize ourselves with the context. Check out this map. Singapore is a city-state with just over 700 square kilometers, but with more than 5.5 million inhabitants. This has forced more than 70% of the land to be built on. Those are the red areas of the map. The remaining 30% includes mostly protected areas or land where one simply cannot build. Basically, the city is overflowing. Faced with such a scenario, it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that accessing a home in Singapore would be a headache, would it? After all, that's the case in similar places such as Hong Kong. Well, strangely enough, it isn't. The reason has a lot to do with Singapore's unique urban development model. Check this out. In 1960, the Singapore government created the Housing and Development Board, a public housing company that was responsible for regulating and managing the land, as well as building and developing real estate projects. And that's because since 1967, most of the land in Singapore has been publicly owned. In that year, 1967, the so-called Land Acquisition Act was approved. This enabled the government to take back ownership of all of the land. That means the land marketed for real estate development is made available under the Housing Board's criteria. That is, there isn't a price system in land commercialization. Let me explain it another way. This public body determines how many homes it will build and at what prices and under what conditions they will be marketed, evidently always below the potential market price. On the other hand, it's this same organization, this Housing and Development Board, which draws land for auction so private developers can build completely private real estate projects. Of course, in every case, the land continues to be publicly owned. That is, the homeowners cannot do whatever they want with it. For example, they can't sell their homes to build a hotel. And the property is more a concession than a property. Allow me to explain. When a citizen of Singapore, and I emphasize this because foreigners can't buy new public housing, gets one of these homes, they aren't really acquiring the land's ownership nor the house itself, but only the right to stay in it. A kind of lease that lasts for 99 years. After that period, the house returns to the state. This is how the Prime Minister of Singapore explains it.
After 99 years, the flat comes back to the state. The government redevelops the land and builds new flats for future generations. This is the only way to recycle the land, to ensure all our descendants can buy new flats on their own. If instead the government sold you the flat on freehold, sooner or later we would run out of land to build new flats. Lee Hsien Loong, Prime Minister of Singapore.
And you have to be careful, because in private developments, this period may be even shorter. Of course, during the lease period, the owners can do whatever they deem appropriate with the house. If they don't want to live in it, they can sell it or they can rent it. In fact, it isn't uncommon, if things are going well, for those who own homes to sell or rent the public homes, which tend to be very austere, especially the old ones, in order to move into private developments, which in Singapore's case are far more luxurious. But the peculiarities of this curious system, they don't end there. Since the body that builds and sells most homes is public, the government uses it as a social policy instrument, or rather an instrument of social engineering. For example, to avoid the formation of ghettos, given that Singapore's population has a certain racial diversity, a building or development's dwellings are allocated in such a way that the proportion of owners has an ethnic distribution that reflects the distribution in the whole country. The population distribution by ethnic group in Singapore, it looks something like this. In each block of homes, the owners are distributed more or less in the same way. If a block or project has, for example, 100 homes, then we'll find 74 Chinese owners, 13 Malaysian owners, 9 Indian owners, and so on. However, that's not a bad thing. Perhaps the worst aspect of this model is that the government uses the granting of homes to promote certain life models. For example, traditional couples don't have any problem applying for government property, but single people or same-sex couples, well, let's just say it's much more complicated for them. Surprised? It is a bit strange to find such interventionism in a supposedly capitalist place. But it shouldn't be surprising. We already told you that Singapore's political, economic, and social model is kind of a mix between free market capitalist policies and very, very paternalistic policies where the state actively promotes certain ways of life and punishes others. In this case, in the area of housing, not only in housing allocation, but also, for example, mortgage approvals, conditions are very advantageous for people who meet the state-imposed criteria. Don't, well, bad luck to you. Want to live alone? Well, sorry. Want to live with a friend? Too bad. You want to live with your same-sex partner? Well, you know, we wish we could help, but probably not going to work out. Now, beyond these rather questionable practices, the truth is that this system has been quite successful. Public housing is much more affordable in Singapore than in other cities with comparable economic success, such as London, Sydney, or Hong Kong. On average, new buyers spend less than a quarter of their income on their mortgage. But just a second, all of this isn't free.
The economic invoice dilemma.
If the government of Singapore is known for one thing, it's for keeping taxes and public spending at bay. However, things are different with the whole housing issue. The system is clearly lacking.
HDB reports $1.47 billion loss in latest financial year as fewer flats sold.
$1.5 billion. That's the difference between what urbanization and construction work costs the state and the income it receives from selling the homes. That's $1.5 billion that is financed from the public budget. The whole housing scheme is basically financed with taxes. Regardless of land ownership, this is the annual allocation that the Singapore government devotes to its housing policy. Perfectly acceptable amount for an economy as big as Singapore's. Now, does this mean that the governments of other countries should take back ownership of city lands and oversee housing development just like the Singapore government does? Well, no, not at all. Singapore's case is very particular. We're talking about a city-state with huge economic success, a state which is managed almost like a company and where land limitations are more than evident. The differences with other countries are quite obvious. Nor is it clear that if it were operating as a free market, a truly free one, the results would be much different. Not to mention the enormous power that such systems grant politicians to design societies at will. But what Singapore has really achieved with this model, and I think it's undeniable, has been to develop an urban planning and real estate price scheme that favors the development of many other activities with greater added value. For example, given that housing prices are capped, Singaporean citizens have a greater capacity to save and invest in, for example, new businesses. Anyway, this is Singapore's unique model, yet another model that's up for debate. So now it's your turn. What do you think of the Singaporean housing model? Well, leave your answer in the comments below. As always, thanks to Reconsider Media for providing the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Please do like and subscribe to this video, and I'll see you next time.